Hi, everyone.
Hey, Marcus Aurelius. Nice to see you. Glad we got everybody here. So we're going to get started. This is the first expert panel of the Refi Meets the World event. We are so excited to chat over here with some experts. I'm going to give it over to Shingy so he can do some introductions.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. So with us, we have Jimbo and Marcus from KlimaDAO. So both are kind of representing some viewpoints on governance as well as transparency within the Web3 or blockchain space, and kind of talking about how that might apply or some of the developments, theses, evolutions that we see that with specifically within the climate space. So without further ado, maybe we start with Yi. Do you want to just give us like a little bit of a background of how you got into Web3, and what aspect of Web3 and governance that you're specifically focused on?
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks so much for the quick intro. Very excited to be here. Thank you very much for having me. Just a couple of sentences about myself. So I came from a venture capital background. I spent a long time in the fintech where I had exposure in the crypto industry as a whole. I recently have started a crypto data analytic platform. We're still in stealth. Raised our first round, very much focused on the ESG data in the crypto industry. When I say ESG, our big focus is actually SNG. That when it comes to the social data, governance data, understanding the spamming and shilling activity in the community. We also have built some data API for the carbon accounting. That's our sort of E side of things. But it's I think that sort of the direction of traveling as a crypto industry is pretty clear. So that's basically myself, and I look forward to have a conversation with Marcus.
Great to meet you, Yi, and hi, everyone. Glad to be here sharing a little bit about KlimaDAO and my thoughts on governance for the intersection of climate and crypto. So my background personally is in data science and data engineering. I worked at a Web2 ad tech company before getting involved in Web3 a couple of years ago. I'm not technically a founder at KlimaDAO, but I did join the DAO before launch, and I've been involved, since about September of last year. And I mostly focus on our data analytics and metrics function, but I've also been involved with some of our, a lot of our governance posts, and managing the protocol on the policy team. So kind of have pretty broad scope, but focused really on using data to make informed decisions and bringing greater transparency and access to the voluntary carbon market. In terms of what Klima as a whole is up to, we really see ourselves as pioneering the use of blockchain technology for climate action, specifically around the bringing an existing climate market, the voluntary carbon market, onto public blockchains and providing liquidity as well as tooling for people to access that market. And you know, according to the IPCC and most of the major groups that research climate action, market-based solutions are an important part of the solution to the climate crisis, and especially when it comes to incentivizing behaviors that are otherwise not profitable. In particular, things like planting trees, converting to renewable energy in places where the capital expenditure is too great for the local financial system, as well as sort of more innovative solutions like direct air capture and biochar and enhanced mineral weathering. There's a ton of these methodologies, but basically what KlimaDAO is trying to do is to create an ecosystem of tooling and liquidity for people to access these markets. And on-chain governance, we have a snapshot on-chain governance process, as well as a governance forum where our community discusses the different initiatives that the DAO is taking up. So more recently, we have a couple of governance posts up concerned with basically taking DAO treasury capital and deploying those assets to support climate projects on the ground directly. So we have a couple of proposals coming forward to basically fund projects in the developing world. In particular, we have one up right now under discussion to fund a cook stove conversion project in a Bangladeshi refugee camp. And the idea there is that by switching or by providing these refugees with clean burning, high efficiency cook stoves, they're going to dramatically reduce the amount of fuel they need, which will open up time for women and girls in particular to become educated and take on other responsibilities outside of fetching firewood. And it also reduces some of the negative health outcomes associated with using traditional cook stoves by reducing the amount of particulate matter in the air. So plus, obviously, they're more efficient and therefore they require less fuel, which means less carbon emissions for the same amount of energy released. So very exciting project. We're still evaluating the partner that we're working with to make sure everything passes the sort of sniff check. But that's one area where we see on-chain governance and the notion of decentralized governance playing a really important role in climate action and carbon markets in particular.
Nice. Well, I'm really glad that you both were able to make it. You guys have really really important roles within the overall climate ecosystem. I think the first thing I want to dive into is this concept of ESG. So one, I want to understand your take, beyond just sort of the dictionary definition of ESG. So what your overall attitude or thought is about ESG. I know there's a lot of conversation about it, sort of being used to greenwash a lot of bad actor type of entities. But I want to really hear your take on ESG as a concept and the direction that it's moving, whether it's moving in the right way or what are some of the issues that it presents us right now.
Marcus, do you want to give a go or should I?
Sure, I can take a first stab. So I guess I just want to draw our attention to the first principle underlying the ESG movement, which is this notion of an externality, right? So in economic theory, when an organization takes some action and that action has a consequence for some party outside of the direct operation of that organization, right? So, a farmer drains all the water out of the local pond to water his fields, and now all the other people in the area who use that water supply don't have any water for themselves. So this is sort of a classic tragedy of the commons, public goods problem. And externalities are usually the cause of these public goods problem because some organization somewhere has an incentive in their own economics internally to generate profit from exploiting that resource. And the negative externality of draining that resource and it no longer being available to others is not priced in to that organization's operations. So in my view, ESG movement is an attempt to get corporations to recognize the negative externalities that they're having and to try to flip those into positive externalities or at least mitigate the negative impact that they're having. So on the environmental front, you have the three pillars: environmental, social, and governance. Like you said, I don't want to get too bogged down in the dictionary definitions, but you can kind of imagine environmental is related to climate and sustainability issues. Social is related to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other sort of social issues like treating LGBTQ communities properly and serving marginalized groups. And then the governance part is more to do with like traditional notions of corporate governance, as well as regulatory issues like interacting with governments and other nonprofits and NGOs around the world that are related to the organization's function. So I think as a whole, like the spirit behind the ESG movement of trying to get corporations to account for their negative externalities is coming from the right place. But I do think it has gotten to a point now where the ESG label is being used to justify things that aren't necessarily justified and to sort of cover up for a lack of transparency into what these organizations are actually doing. A really concrete example of this is these net zero plans that many organizations now have. And the way that the plans are set up is it's like a 45-page PDF document. Buried somewhere in the plan is some specific reference to how the organization will actually mitigate its ongoing emissions. And what we would like to see is that sort of flipped, where like there's a nice, easy, user-friendly way to understand the actual actions that are being taken, the impact that an organization is having to meet their commitments. So on the climate front, we've built a pledge application that we see as sort of a prototype for what is possible with on-chain carbon, which is, an organization has a pledge. I can provide an example where they state what their commitments are, right? Their estimates for their emissions, the methodology they use to arrive at those estimates. And then on the other side of the screen, you can see the actual retirements that they've done of tokenized carbon on chain. And so there's a clear link between the commitment and the thing that was done to meet the commitment, which I think is sorely lacking in many of the ESG commitments we see today.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I think you have given one the textbook, really the definition of the ESG is very, very much focused on the externality. I really agree with that. And I think that movement becoming controversial in recent years was largely because of social risk corporation. There's quite a lot of greenwashing and the box-ticking exercise going on. And apparently with all the controversials of the tweets from Elon Musk, critics around the ESG definition is becoming a really big topic for both the public company as well as, I guess, the people who really care about those cause behind. What we at UNIS is doing right now, I guess it's sort of like, even though I use the word ESG, but it's very much focused in the industry of the digital assets. When it comes to the ESG for the crypto industry, I guess the first question people ask is that, what do you mean exactly there? So we previously worked with a couple of really big, we're still working with them, but a couple of really big asset managers who are having exposure to the crypto industry and have done a lot of work investigating, understanding the key ESG issue associated with this digital asset area in general. That in the environmental side, even though basically when it comes to the crypto industry, that is primarily associated with crypto mining, another very polarized topic that the industry has been talking a lot about, and the energy efficiency around operations, another topic. And then you also have a social and governance. And I think those two topics are very, very relevant to the industry as a whole, where I'm saying it's not really the ESG on the corporation, but what is a really ESG framework for the crypto and the digital asset industry as a whole. And how could we help people who are not in this industry to understand the topics such as like cybersecurity, the privacy, as well as like the trading governance, voting, regulatory, and how the tokenomics work. And that is basically our data platform is trying to provide to our clients around the data around those information. And in the light of the recent FTX event, it's a very textbook failure of the corporation governance. So I think that topic just get more interesting and more timely in general. That's thoughts from me.
Yeah, definitely. The merits of, it's interesting. I think we think of on-chain governance and DAO governance as being something new and different from corporate governance, but I think it's very clearly just an evolution. And obviously the FTX situation is a failure in corporate governance, and I think demonstrates the power of transparent on-chain governance systems, because there is no question of like, are there adults in the room if it's all happening in public on forums and on-chain voting.
Absolutely.
So one thing that I'm curious about is from an enforcement perspective. I think so. There's one thing to make everything sort of exposed. I got the impression, if we're looking at the FTX, that there's also a diligence issue on the part of at least some of the institutional investors. And then, we also have the case of 2008, where, there was corporate governance in place, from an SEC perspective, but the enforcement just like was non-existent. What are ways that blockchain can provide that level of enforcement that we don't see in regulated spaces, in the traditional finance world?
I'll be really interested in Marcus' view from especially KlimaDAO, like from the DAO perspective, that the observation, the thoughts around the governance topic, especially compare with the traditional sort of governance structure? And what is your sort of like the first-hand takeaway there?
Yeah, I mean, just to address the point around traditional corporate governance, I mean, I don't think anyone is under the impression that traditional corporate governance is like working well and everything's great. I think there's a lot of
Right.
problems with traditional corporate governance. Proxy voting basically eliminates the participation of individual shareholders. It's very rare for individuals to actually vote. And of course, compared to the hedge funds and pensions that have massive positions, the vote of a single holder, so it's interesting. I think some of the same problems that exist in traditional corporate governance have been carried over. Like, for instance, the fact that large holders in most on-chain governance systems can exert undue influence. And there's definitely a tension there, because if you have a larger stake in the protocol or in the corporation in traditional corporate governance, then you probably should have some more say than someone who just has a few pennies of stake. But on the other hand, there should be some balance to that, where it's not just large holders able to control the entire protocol unilaterally. So at KlimaDAO, we're thinking a lot about this, and we'd like to move towards something that's more more evenly spread. So we're looking at things like Gitcoin Passport, which is a Sybil resistance mechanism that allows you to identify an individual as an actual individual, a unique human. And you can use that in different ways. So one thing we've been exploring, we haven't put forward this proposal yet, but we've been discussing it internally and figuring out if it makes sense, is to give people a boost basically to their token weighting if they have proven that they are a unique individual. So this would sort of provide a mechanism to give more influence to individuals who are willing to sort of go through this process of attesting that they're an individual, but in a way that isn't like discriminating against any one shareholder or any one token holder. So I think something what I would like to see is well, I haven't really answered your question, which is like, how does crypto address some of these issues around traditional corporate governance and specifically in the FTX situation, the sort of lack of oversight. So one of the unique things about on-chain systems is that the code that's deployed, assuming that they're immutable contracts, is going to operate the way that it's written. And so there's a certain level of reliability that you can get from on-chain systems that you won't get from an off-chain system ever. And I mean, even something like proof of reserve, which has become very trendy now in the wake of the FTX fallout, which is basically where you have an auditor, look at your books off-chain, and then they post some on-chain data that says like, yeah, we looked at their books and this is how they appeared at that time. But there's still an Oracle problem there, right? You don't necessarily have a guarantee that the funds didn't move around in between audits. So it's whenever you have funds sitting in an off-chain system, like on an exchange or in a bank, there isn't a authoritative public data source that you can look to for the ground truth of where those funds actually are. Whereas if you contrast that with something like KlimaDAO, like all of the transactions associated with the operation of the protocol, the payment of our contributors from the DAO wallet, all of that is public and on chain. And so if there are any questions about like where are the funds sitting or which multi-sig has access to move these funds, all of that can be seen transparently on chain. Whereas like apparently Sam, at FTX had some backdoor ability to move funds around off chain because off chain systems allow that kind of access.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, I want to just echo what Marcus has said, and that also brings me sort of reading a very interesting piece of quote today from the FTX insolvency, sort of like the professional John Ray, who have oversaw the Aaron's sort of insolvency a few years ago, but he mentioned that FTX was the worst case of the 40 years of his career as a corporate failure he has ever seen. He's like, I've never seen that a complete absence of trustworthy financial information has occurred in FTX. So I think that's a very typical sort of like Web2 failure of FTX as a centralized exchange. And it's really interesting because in the Web2 version, I guess, a number of key principles that's been promoted. For example, transparency, that's like very key for the part of the any corporate governance that's been promoted into a level that in the DAO, which is really hard to be sort of imagined in the Web2 governance framework, as well as things like basically the outreach of the people who is able to vote is really bring to from a very small number of individuals to anybody sitting in the different parts of the world. So I think there's a number of very key sort of like when the global benefit outreach as well as the transparency and the resilience is something that definitely blockchain and have bring the governance into a new level. I think a lot of quite forward-looking organization that have been just learning and understanding the benefit of DAO right now, rather than really taking the step, getting there. But we do have we do already see the benefits, and I think people in the Web3 industry, like people who participating in the votes, in the putting together a proposal, is get real benefits. Get really sort of like being this big experiment and see the benefits of the transparency come out of it.
One thing that I'm wondering on top of what you both have mentioned in terms of we'll say that the on-chain components of auditing, governance, et cetera, is how does that interplay with the regulatory environment? I think you both are based in the UK, or Marcus, are you based in the US?
Yep, I'm in the US.
You're in the US. So I guess then we have the transatlantic perspectives. So Marcus, from like an SEC perspective and from a congressional perspective, and Yi from, I guess I'm not really sure who the overseeing regulatory bodies are for securities, but I would imagine that there's something similar to the SEC or equivalent to the SEC in the UK.
So this is a very, very timely topic, because yesterday the UK Law Commission actually just published the issues like the consultation. They started to look into a governance structure, money laundering tax related to a DAO. So this is very, very timely topic. And whether that look like eventually in the UK current legal framework is TBD. But I think it's really interesting that it's currently on the regulation, the regulatory bodies sort of like frontline. As you can see that they started to think about it, trying to understand it, putting resources into it. There is a lot of like the questions they've been really, sort of like trying to learn and study things like how this governance, how the governance underpin the projects in the DeFi, how they are structured and governed, how the decisions are made. I think we will take some time for the regulatory bodies to get a really good hands on what's going on with DAO. I think, like in general, not even regulatory bodies, but just we're still seeing that different models, how that sort of unfolded while we are having this conversation. But I think this is a very big topic, and it's a very timely topic, and it will be really interesting to hear Marcus' perspective from a US legal framework as well.
Yeah, there's definitely still a lot of uncertainty in the US regulatory landscape. Obviously, this latest batch of fraud, for lack of a better term, with FTX is going to ruffle some feathers. The really interesting thing is that there's been progress, honestly. So KlimaDAO worked with Senators Lummis and Gillibrand on the draft legislation that they were preparing. It's basically a framework legislation, so it probably won't pass as is. But we were able to get some language in there that clarified the definition of a DAO. So the expectation is that in the future, there will be subsequent pieces of legislation that are narrower in scope, that take pieces from this large bill. And we're hoping that at some point, when it's appropriate, there will be some clarity around the definition of a DAO within the US. Because right now, only the states, so like Wyoming, Colorado, and a couple of other states have implemented basically a DAO legal structure where, like in Wyoming, for instance, it's an LLC. You can form an LLC and it can be operated as a DAO and yet still have a legal entity in the state of Wyoming. But that isn't recognized at a federal level yet. In terms of like DeFi and like broader crypto regulation, I mean, I think there's still a lot of education to be done, honestly. The lawmakers that we've met with seem to get it, but we've met with the ones that are more forward thinking about crypto. I think the general perception is still, yeah, there's still a lot of education to be done. I'll put it that way. So anyone who is in a position to interact with regulators at any level, it's definitely a great idea to educate and share what you're working on, especially if what you're working on is not like the typical crypto use case. So like Klima has been able to position itself fairly well, and like I think we have a pretty good value prop because of we are trying to use the technology for bringing transparency to this important climate market rather than sort of speculation or sort of pure financial applications, because that's really not something that most lawmakers are familiar with. What they hear about are like the FTXs and the Lunaterras of the world. They don't usually hear about the positive social impact use cases for the technology.
So what is that seems like it could be a challenge. I mean, in the US in particular, we have a particularly old Congress. My assumption, and you've had some more direct interactions, is that they are likely going to be um, maybe more challenging to work with. From the UK perspective, I have no idea sort of what the sort of temperature is. But could you both give a kind of a sense of like your thesis on where legal bodies are moving towards from this standpoint? I know that it's very dynamic and likely to change, but obviously, you guys are respectively kind of making some assumptions about where things are going to be in terms of doing your own long-term strategic planning.
Yeah, I mean, from the U.S. perspective, one thing that like it's just now become clear in the last day or so that Republicans will control the House and Democrats will control the Senate and obviously the presidency for the next 2 years. So I'm not really expecting a whole lot to happen unless it's on a bipartisan basis. And things that happen on a bipartisan basis in the U.S. tend to be pretty narrow in scope. It has to be something that like both parties can get behind. So if anything, what I expect over the next couple of years is that we'll see some small, narrow pieces of legislation related to crypto pass. I think we'll see something related to stablecoins because ultimately the US's biggest opportunity when it comes to crypto is that right now crypto is basically a dollar system. Like every coin is priced in dollars, except for NFTs where you pay for them in ETH. Like pretty much everything is denominated in dollars, and stable coins are one of the biggest use cases for blockchain technology. So I think that the U.S. is getting the legislators are understanding the opportunity, and they want to take action on things like the Lunaterras of the world, and now the FTXs of the world that are yeah, are not operating above board. And there's definitely a delicate path to walk. I'm hopeful that we will get specific targeted legislation that addresses, key pain points without casting a broad net across the entire industry. Because ultimately, like all that will do is push people offshore. I mean, arguably, this is why FTX was operating outside of American jurisdiction because they, did not want to go through the sort of rigmarole of getting recognized. And there wasn't necessarily a way even for them to get recognized to do the kind of futures and leverage trading that they were doing without going through this, in the way they were doing it. So I realize I'm not saying a whole lot, but basically what I'm hopeful for is that we'll get some targeted legislation, some specific issues that can be addressed in a precise way, rather than broad sweeping legislation that tries to like push all of crypto offshore, because that will only damage the United States' leadership position in this important industry. And if you look at, for instance, the last generation of the internet, most major tech companies were born in the U.S. And it would be a shame for the next generation of technology companies to be pushed out of the U.S. just because they use this new technology.
Yeah, I agree with what Marcus has said. I think from the UK and EU perspective, the real, sort of like most comprehensive regulation in the major jurisdiction is definitely the MiCA from the EU, and I think that's going to set a tone, to be honest, for how it looks like in the UK as well. Because what UK will do is just look at what happened with the MiCA when it got implemented. in the next year in EU. I mean, end of the next year or 2024, and then see how that go and learn from it. And I bet that is something that US will do as well. So with MiCA, really the goal is to, I mean, I think that the full name of MiCA is the Markets in Crypto Asset Regulation. The objective is to provide legal certainty for crypto assets. I think that will be helpful, to be honest, because I think in the US, one thing is that it takes, I mean, I only vaguely heard about it. It takes a while to just understand who should be regulated, is that SEC or is that everybody's to oversee the crypto asset as a whole. It seems to take some time, but to have quite strict rules, the quite sort of like rigorous rules in the EU would potentially add quite a lot of compliance burden to the player here as well, which is, I think that there will be some merits, but there will be some limit. I'm not a lawyer myself. Actually, my COO is a lawyer for like 15 years, who is a lot better placed to talk about this topic. But I pick up from the conversations with her that there's a number of like things being very sort of like on the top of the beaker. One is really around stablecoin regulation there, around their liquidity requirement. As well as NFT will be sort of like different, I think have a different treatment likely from other crypto assets. There's also very interesting and very important sort of a part of MiCA is actually the environmental disclosure for financial services. They will need to comply the environmental disclosure requirement that I think whether it's going to be, sort of like scope 1, 2, 3, or it's going to be proof of work / proof of stake. We need to see the final text to understand. And the industry, also the financial services, as well as crypto industry, have about a year and a half to get them really prepared for MiCA. But I think that's going to be super interesting for like people around the world to see like what it's like when there is actually a quite comprehensive law to regulate this industry as a whole.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting point. That there's going to be a wave of the external legislation, and I kind of asked you guys a couple pointed questions in that space. But what I'm also really interested in is the self-regulation aspect, because obviously, I think you both pointed out that there's a level of reactiveness from governments, that they see the disasters and they don't necessarily see the actual useful value-added implementations of Web3. And so I think that requires there to be successful DAOs that can actually show that and actually like not just like do cool stuff, but have an outsized impact on that. And so what I'm curious about is from both of your perspectives, in order to accomplish that, to really showcase like a great example of like amazing outcomes that are driven by these voluntary attestations, this voluntary sort of governance across ES and G, like who are the stakeholders internally within a project that are essential for driving it forward, and like what are the kinds of interactions, or what is the kind of maybe process, or maybe culture, maybe not the right word, but like what is the dynamic that needs to happen within these projects for them to successfully demonstrate this kind of self-restraint or self-governance?
Yeah, I mean, one specific example I can point to, it's a little technical, so I don't know if it's what you're going for, but there were some carbon credits that were bridged in the Klima Toucan ecosystem that were from a methodology that was no longer considered additional. Basically, it was considered that these credits were not proper to be used for retirement, and in the traditional market, they're no longer used. For the last 2 years, no one has used them. But they wound up getting bridged through sort of an oversight, basically, on Toucan's part. But it is what it is. They really should never have been usable to begin with in the Vera registry, but Vera never pulled them off the market. And so they ended up in the pool. And basically what Klima did is we had a governance vote and we allocated capital from the treasury to be used to clean up these credits. So I think it's a really good demonstration of what the on-chain governance process allows you to do, in a way that like there's no governance process to go to Vera and be like, hey, Vera, you should destroy these credits, right? So I just think it demonstrates that Web3 unlocks some decisions that wouldn't necessarily be considered even in the traditional world. Is that the kind of thing you were going for?
Sorry, I unmute myself. I mute myself. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting topic because I heard a lot of voices saying, crypto is decentralized, and it's very unfair for industry that as young as crypto to take the burden of self-regulation. And I also think it's really the good of the sort of it's really in crypto's best of interest to have a level of self-regulation. It's just we see that how slow the regulation in the whole world has been moved. And I think also just looking at the history that how much it cost for, like, in 2018 that, I have a very close friend work for JP Morgan that on their trading desk was accused for spoofing and ended up paying nearly 1 billion in fines. So in general, I think in any other industry, like it all started with a level of self-regulation in the beginning, and I think it's always a best practice, but it takes time. And I think a core for the self-regulation is to identify a level of like collaboration as well as how the industry as a whole collaborate together on this compliance sort of like progress. And I think it's not super easy given the age of the crypto industry, but I definitely see the progress from a different front. I think, again, FTX is the best example that when it happened, you see that there are more than 10 big crypto exchanges straight away jump into the proof of reserve, etc., etc. So I think all this initiative, to some extent, are triggered by a large black swan event or a regulatory crackdown. But we definitely see they are happening, and I think they are absolutely in the crypto's best interest as well.
Yeah, definitely agree on the need for collaboration. And the crypto space is relatively new. The crypto climate intersection is even newer. And we're already seeing the emergence of organizations that are facilitating collaboration and interoperability across the different participants in this sort of refi ecosystem. So that's definitely a positive sign, and is a key step to self-regulation to have coordination between actors, in the same ecosystem.
So I see positives and negatives there. I mean, I agree with Marcus about the positives. One thing that struck me about what Yi said was, it takes a black swan or a regulatory crackdown to really get people moving. And I'm wondering if there are currents where there are enough people that are forward thinking enough that we don't necessarily need to have an FTX equivalent in the climate space in Web3 before more folks aggressively started implementing some of these approaches.
Yeah, it's a very fair question. And I mean, frankly, I think we already see some of a potential systemic risk in the form of flow carbon. They've made a splash. I know they're at COP, and they've been very prominent in the space. They've been around for some time now, and let's just say that their history makes it look like they're operating a centralized business and trying to call it blockchain. And I have some concerns about that. I'm not going to lie. Especially in the wake of FTX, I think it's really important that if you're going to call yourself like a Web3 blockchain project, you should probably have some contracts deployed on chain and like at least be putting some record of your off-chain activity on chain. Otherwise it's kind of hard to understand to what extent you are actually a blockchain technology company if you're not building on chain.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree, Marcus. I really applaud that you sort of shout it out, and I think yeah, there's a level of risks, and I heard like people from ReFi have also aired the same concern about this sort of like big player, but also very centralized. I think FTX is one example. They are another centralized example in the ReFi space.
Hey Shingi, if I could just chime in for 1 second and kind of relate it a little bit to what some of the listeners are used to in the flow blockchain for the lower NFT projects and stuff. We do often talk about a lot of the not just business practices, but a lot of the utility and stuff like that being on chain. A lot of the results of any game, we'll call it, being on chain. So from what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm kind of looking at it the wrong way, but it seems like the accountability of being on chain is from the small project to the global standard projects of that's the one of the most important things we're trying to push, correct?
Well, I don't necessarily think that like all data about everything should be on chain. It's more like if your core business operation is say reselling carbon credits, right? Like you buy carbon credits off of a project and then you resell them at a markup. And you're claiming to be like a Web3 carbon provider, right? Where you're gonna the idea that you would like hold all your credits off chain and then like sell them to people over the counter with no on chain record of the transaction. Basically, they just like the buyer sends you money on chain and then you off chain send them the the real asset. It's not really delivering on the promise of blockchain, right? At that level, you're using it as a payment method and you're relying on the off chain transaction to deliver those credits, right? And I personally know some people who like gave money to Flow to buy credits, and let's just say that like they never actually took delivery of the credits, and now they're down badly, and they want their money back, and there's no way for them to get it except to like go ask Flow nicely to give it back. As opposed to like if you compare that with a credit like say BCT, which is a carbon pool trading on Polygon, where there's a liquidity pool on SushiSwap. The liquidity is provided as a public good by KlimaDAO, and that liquidity will be there until and unless the KlimaDAO governance voters decide to reallocate that liquidity. And so it's a very public on-chain system where like if you hold the carbon credit, you can go and sell it or buy more of it or retire it. And there's no like centralized counterparty that you have to go ask permission to in order to make that transaction. So I think that illustrates some of the difference and like which parts of the business it's important to be on chain. Like I'll be clear, like we host, for instance, a carbon dashboard. And that carbon dashboard, even though it's reading on-chain data, it combines that on-chain data with off-chain data and then is actually running in like a DigitalOcean, like an off-chain cloud provider. But the underlying business model, right, the underlying operation is the transaction and retirement of on-chain carbon. So I think it's not a binary. It's not like we want everything always to be on chain. It's more like the core function, the core financial operations should be on chain to give you the level of trust and transparency that you can't get from like off chain traditional financial mechanisms. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, 100%. I'm so glad you touched on that because that was kind of where I was getting at in like business in general. This is something that, I'm sure you all are in your areas of expertise and you know what it's like to talk to laymen who don't really understand a lot either about climate change, about the blockchain, or either. And it's challenging at times. And so a lot of the analogies I like to use are using businesses, and if they're the main parts of where they're putting their money was on chain, for instance. And now again, this has always been theoretical in my explanations to people, but it makes a lot of sense to them to say that like not every single action you make needs to be accounted for, but the core stuff that have to do with investor money or promises and roadmap stuff that's kind of what you're saying, correct?
Well, and in particular, like the functioning of the protocol, right? Like, if the protocol's goal is to like, well, anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but I guess the point I'm getting at is it's important to have a clear vision in your mind of like what are the core business operations and how can I provide my users with the assurance that those business operations are being carried out like as promised, right, or as described. And if that needs to be the case, then like operating on chain is the way to provide that level of transparency and verifiability. if you're just providing like, your, I don't know, here's a good example, right? Let's say that your business has nothing to do with blockchain. Let's say that you're operating like, I don't know, a plumbing business, right? But you want to take payment in crypto. Then the payments come to you in crypto, right? But you do your off-chain plumbing work, and like that off-chain mechanism is the core of your business. And I'm not saying like the records of each plumbing activity should be put on chain. That might be absurd. Although one day I could see that happening, honestly. But right now it's not really practical. Um, so yeah, I guess I'm trying to draw the distinction between like general like administrative operations that might take place off chain, or like hosting a web application on an off-chain hosting service like we do with our carbon dashboard, is very different from like running your core business off chain and then claiming to be like a Web3 blockchain company.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
For sure. I forget the original question. I mean, I think we were trying to get at like, what are the, what are the advantages of, or what data should be on chain and off chain, but I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, I think it's more along the lines of like, what are some of the dynamics that need to take place for that self-regulation to actually like work functionally.
Yeah, definitely a lot of collaboration. One of the interesting things about being in the carbon markets is that they've been around for a couple decades at this point, and they are basically a self-regulating market. There's no direct CFTC or SEC oversight of the carbon markets right now in the US. The CFTC is considering regulating the carbon markets, but they sort of recognize that there is an existing self-regulatory system in the carbon markets that they don't want to disrupt. So the CFTC had this recent hearing, the first convening on the voluntary carbon market back in June. And it's very clear that they're being very considerate and thoughtful about how the CFTC wants to be involved in this market. But I think it sets actually a really good example for how we can position ourselves within crypto and within the crypto climate space to interact with regulators in a more responsible way, by first showing like, hey, we have these organizations, we have collaboration happening within the space to address systemic risk and self-regulate. I think that will go a long way to assuaging some of the regulators' concerns.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Marcus. Marcus is really a real expert in the carbon credit space. Yeah, I learned a bunch of things from what you said as well. Super interesting.
Yi, from a data perspective, like where do you see the value of like the kinds of analytics that you're driving? Is it more on the side of regulators, or do you think, to Marcus's point about the internal dynamics that need to be sort of built in, or the collaboration that needs to be built in, is that sort of the use case, or are you agnostic?
Our use case is really focused on understanding the quality of a project by using the combination of the on-chain analytics and also social data as a proxy of the community. It's a long sentence, but to make it sort of like easier to understand, it's our data is really focused a lot on understanding the quality of a project. I come from a VC background myself. The early stage information asymmetry in the sort of like VC startup market is something that always fascinating to me. But then when I start in the crypto industry, I felt like it was kind of interesting, even though people felt like crypto industry, like especially in the early stage, like when the projects are relatively small, it's kind of a gray market, which I disagree, because you do have a lot of on-chain data, provide a lot of insights. For example, FTX, like people use that to track on-chain activity, was really powerful, as well as the social actually data tell people a lot if you're really stuck into it. Our current use case is really our use persona are very much focused on the funds as well as crypto exchanges, for them to understand the red flags of the project from early on. There's a bunch of you sort of like interested from the compliance team primarily. As they wanted to know pretty much like early days what is being the concern surfaced from community, as well as like what sort of a suspicious stuff going on from the on-chain analytics, and that is what we currently trying to do, to bring both together as a sort of a comprehensive picture on both sides.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I mean,
So
we
I want
just
to.
get started. We are like 6 months old, so still in
Yeah.
style. So a ton of work need to be done. But I think it's really interesting is that in the winter and in the sort of like the bull and bear market have a very, very different strategy, right? When the market is just like in the bull, that people like just like there's a very big momentum on the pump and dump. There's just like nobody really look into the fundamentals or the red flags. But when it comes back to the winter, people actually started to care about it. And where the sort of a red flag comes, it can come from all different directions. It's actually really interesting that to find the people talk in the Reddit, people talk in the Twitter, to sort of like have a way to bring all this like noisy information in one dashboard and present that to people clearly is something that we're trying to do.
Okay. So, I mean, it sounds like it's almost like a diligence boost, like a public diligence boost for potential investors in a given project.
Yeah, so like due diligence for investors, for liquidity provider, as well as for head of listing of crypto exchanges.
Amazing. I want to give folks a chance to take a break before our next AMA. So what I want to do now is just say thank you both to Marcus and Yi for dropping a lot of knowledge about the governance side of things. I think this is a really important topic, especially right now, for people to really get a clear sense of. And so your comments provided a lot of clarity, I hope. I mean, we're recording this, we'll share this out to other folks, but the goal here is really just to start a conversation. And I guess just one last thought, one parting thought from both of you, sort of lightning round style, is as we think about targets, over the next 12 months, thinking about it from the standpoint of like similar to COP, they come out with targets for the year. What is a target in your mind over the next 12 months from a governance perspective that you feel would be something achievable by most climate crypto projects, just strictly from a governance perspective?
Oh, well, I'd like to see just speaking for KlimaDAO, I'd like to see us double the number of individual voters participating in our governance system. We've had a problem with voter participation dropping off, and we're looking into ways to get more people engaged.
What I think really be interesting is that to see that if there's going to be more carbon credit market, sort of like this trend of carbon credit market moving to a blockchain-based solution, that how this trend is going to continue in the next phase. I think that's super interesting. I still think that's a big market, like the problem to be solved. I think that's not really a governance, I think, related target though. But that's something that I think on a general sort of macro level, that's something, a trend that I would be really interesting to see, because it's just we have a really urgent climate agenda. I think the both two trends laying together, that will be to see the acceleration of the progress.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I would love to see 51% of the VCM be on chain by this time next year. I think that's reasonably achievable, and we have registries moving now. It's just a question of how quickly they'll move.
It's a bold target. I'm going to circle that one.
Check back in a year. It was great to meet you all. Thanks for having me. And we should follow up. I'm a data person, so I'd love to pick your brain about how you're approaching on-chain climate data.
Absolutely, I would love to pick up this. After this panel, such a pleasure to meet you. And I wanted to say thank you both, Jim as well as Asob, to have me and Marcus. This was fascinating. I mean, to be honest, this is my very first panel on the Discord, so sorry for being a little bit clumsy, like grandma trying to figure out like how to join properly, but it was really cool, and I learned so much from all of you.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you both for joining. I know it's getting towards late in the evening for you, Yi, in London, and I know this is sort of like midday randomly for you, Marcus. But thank you both. This was wonderful.
Absolutely. Glad I can make it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both so much. And Shingy, what I'll do is I'll throw on some music, and just an FYI, if you do want to turn down the tempo bot, just go ahead and long click it or right click it. Put on some music just for the next 5-10 minutes until we get our next AMA coming up. We are really excited to get going. Again, thank you to the two speakers, and enjoy some tunes.
All right.
I'm gonna give you everything, everything. Pop star chick, high key, boring. Takes my clothes and calls me horny. Takes my clothes, I think she corny. Get your money, girl, don't worry. Says I'm garbage, just ignores me. Wish my shit was more top 40.